Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 5 for Mark 9057. And we are going to be talking all things Twitter this week. Before we get moving straight into the lecture, though, I did want to let you know that some of the examples that I've still included within this video lecture are from a couple of years ago, where I'll be talking about lists and looking at some live Twitter activity. The content is still completely relevant. The tools that I'm showing you and the process and the operational elements of what I'm showing you are still really relevant. I just wanted to let you know up front that we'll be talking about Amber Rose and the Kardashian fight, which was a couple of years ago, as well as some other issues. So just so you know when you see it, I know that it's a little dated, but the content is still totally relevant for tonight's lecture. So I want to take a look at Twitter today. Without a doubt, Twitter is by far my favorite social platform. It is the one that I've had that has rather had the most impact directly on my life. And I'll share some of those stories as we kind of move along in tonight's lecture. And I think it's important for us to be able to take a look at, who's using Twitter and how they're using Twitter. We're going to make sure, of course, that you have an overview of the basic terms in Twitter if you're not that familiar with them. We definitely will be talking about hashtags and how you do searches for content. We'll be talking about lists, and I'm a big proponent of lists. And tonight we'll be able to focus in on how they work specifically and how you can make them work for you. We'll look at some third-party apps that you may have heard of and you may be familiar with, and we'll look at what those look like in practical use. And then we'll talk, of course, about how do you market using Twitter. And I'm going to introduce you to Twitter chats in case you haven't come across them so far. So what you see here in this picture is a set of babushka dolls that were part of a Kickstarter campaign that I participated in a few years ago. And these are all one-of-a-kind, hand-painted dolls based off of the history of Twitter. So at the time that these were released, Dick Costolo was the CEO of Twitter. And he is no longer the CEO of Twitter, as you can read from the byline here on the page. Jack is back as the CEO of Twitter. But there's other people, of course, involved in the Twitter story, notably here. So next in the line from Dick Costolo is Ev Williams. And then you have Jack Dorsey. And then you see Biz Stone. And then Noah Glass. Of note here, and unless you were a user way back when Twitter first started, then you would maybe not be familiar with this little item on the end, this little blue whale, and that's called the fail whale. And the fail whale used to exist when Twitter would be over capacity and the system couldn't handle the volume of content that was happening. And that's because at the time when it was first launched, it just didn't have kind of the server infrastructure to be able to support the volume of users that they have now. So the fail whale is something that you don't see in the current state of Twitter, but it is certainly something that existed way back when. So, of course, all startup stories have a different points of view. And so these are the 4 people who were behind the scenes and who actually helped launch Twitter. Now, if you look at the kind of the pre and the post Twitter companies that these guys were all involved with, you can see that there was some companies that actually there was some similarities there. Like that's where they had met originally. So you can see that Odeo, which was a company where 3 of the 4 players actually first met, and then Obvious, which became where they all joined forces, so to speak. And, there's, as with many startup stories, there's always contention as to who did what and who was important and who wasn't important and who was a part of it. Well, Twitter is not immune to that beginning story conflict either. If you read this book called Hatching Twitter by Nick Bilton, he actually covers some of that contention and some of the background story of the beginning of the company, which I think is always really interesting. So before I move on, though, I wanted to highlight that there's always something very telling in the startup community. When you look at the success of an organization or the success of a company, rather, like Twitter, and the impact that it's had, not only, of course, on the immediate audience, but on what they did not foresee, per se, but a global audience and a global audience of activists, social activists, is, the ability for them to actually tap into something and create something great, and then really kind of take that skill set and spread it out amongst other opportunities as well. So you can see that the 2 companies that are highlighted here in green being Medium.com and Square. So these are two massively successful companies that have come into being post Twitter for Ev and Biz and Jack. So look, I talk to them about them as if I know them, of course. Don't we all? But I think it's important to point out that if you look at like Ev Williams' beginning, he started off and he created blogger.com, so which is the original blogging platform that really started the blogging movement as it was, or as it is rather. And that has now evolved. He's kind of come full circle, and now he's actually running and part of creating medium.com. And Medium is actually a hugely successful blogging platform. In the early days, you required a Twitter account and you had to be invited into the platform to actually publish on it. Now it's more open, but now it's more of a curated environment. I've been very successful personally with blogging on Medium as well. And I think it taps more into kind of a niche market. So I think it's a really popular market for people who are looking for startup or technology kind of pieces of work, as well as kind of leadership and personal development. But truly, of course, people talk about a million different ideas and stories on Medium. So we'll be looking at that as a blogging platform actually when we talk about blogging in a couple of weeks. And then there's Square, and Square is again, another hugely successful startup. And this is in the payment space. So this is in the mobile payment space. So you may have seen Square. If anybody participates in a farmer's market or goes to flea markets, you'll often see vendors who, if you want to pay by credit card, they actually take your information. They take your credit card and they put a little white square at the end of either their iPad or their iPhone or their Android phone. And they swipe your credit card and then it comes up and it gives you a spot for signature and you can get your emailed receipt to you. Well, that's Square. And they're one of the leading e-commerce, mobile payment companies globally right now. They're doing immensely well. So there's not really a surprise when you actually look at the impact of Twitter and the success of Twitter and how Ev and Biz and Jack specifically have been able to actually translate into their next stories and their next startups. So take a second to read this quote. So this was a conversation between Ev Williams and Jack Dorsey. And I think it's really important to point out actually, and I love it as kind of an insight into personalities within the startup culture. And I think it's because, besides, there's two gentlemen that really can lay claim to actually inventing the internet. So the first would be Vint Cerf. And his name is Vint, and his last name is Cerf, Cerf. And he is one of the people that actually created the IP language, right? So he's the one who actually created a language for computers to actually talk to one another. And that's the backbone of the internet. And then there's also Tim Berners-Lee, who actually created the language around web pages and the World Wide Web. So that graphical interface that we see, that you're actually viewing this video through, he actually created that interface. So when you talk about inventing things, they're two of the people who actually invented things in the technology realm. What Twitter did, what Facebook has done, what LinkedIn has done, and what other startups in this space have done and other companies in this space have done is they've capitalized on a way to do something better online. So it's important to kind of differentiate between that from an egotistical statement like you created or you invented something. You didn't. You actually capitalized and maybe fixed a problem. But invention really is in the hands of the few when we're talking about especially the online space. Nonetheless, I think that Hatching Twitter is probably going to be a really interesting read if you're looking at some insights and background into how a company comes to be and what can actually happen from behind the scenes that, of course, is not usually part of much of the public story. So you've heard me say it a number of times throughout this course already, and you're going to continue to hear me say this for the next number of weeks. But it's really, really important that you know where your audience is online so that you can identify them and go to the right place where they are. It's not reasonable to expect people to come to you. You need to be able to go to them on the right platforms and find them and speak to them where they are already. So whether this is about finding your right audience for a project or your own business, it's also really important. I mean, even if you're looking at demographics and where people are playing right now when it comes to building your final project for this course. So paying attention to the metrics and understanding where your audience is and what the audience is of the makeup of these different social platforms is a really important step in figuring out where you're going to be spending your marketing dollars and energy. So if we look at Twitter, we can see that the numbers continue to grow, and all these numbers are a little bit dated. They're still indicative of where they are right now. And it's a little hard to get some information from Twitter, of course, because these are still companies that like to hold some of their numbers close to the chest, so to speak. So Twitter skews more male than it does female. You can see that it is also still a young person's platform, all things being relative. And the one interesting demographic that's not actually indicated here on this graph, but is part of the Business Insider Social Demographics report that I included in the week 1 resources in Google Drive, is the fact that you're seeing an increase in non-white users on Twitter, which makes sense when you look at the rise of social initiatives in and around Black Lives Matter or the Arab Spring uprising. You can see that Twitter is not just the domain of white males in North America, and so it's really important to pay attention to that rising demographic as well. When you look at the big picture of Twitter, you can see these numbers that are supplied by them. Not incredibly insightful, but you can still extrapolate some meaning from them. You can see how much they're growing globally, right? And what that presence mean. They do have 35 offices around the world, including Canada. Almost 80% of their accounts are outside of the US. Something Twitter hasn't shared here publicly, actively on their own, is the number of dormant accounts, or number of accounts where people, created an account and never tweet, or created an account and tweet like maybe once, which is, some people have said that it's anywhere up to from 20 to 40%. So, as with any kind of social platform, as with any company, you have to take any bit that they report with a little bit of grain of salt. So always be a critical thinker when it comes to looking at these metrics, and don't take everything just by rote. Interestingly, Twitter's monthly active users, so their MAU, there's also the DAU, which is their daily active users, has dropped since last year from 320 million to 310 million. So does that mean the platform's not growing? It could still be growing, but it could mean that the number of people who are actually using the platform on an active basis is notably decreasing. 10 million people is actually a pretty notable decrease. So its growth has slowed, but it's still really robust when you look at it in relation to other social platforms. So it's still an active platform. But if you're paying any attention to the news, you will have heard that Twitter is somewhat struggling with what is it going to be in its next iteration. It's already established itself as a real-time avenue and platform for people to communicate news updates and whatnot. But I think that they're struggling with how do they bring extra value to the experience for the users on Twitter. Globally, if you're looking at Twitter as a platform, it's just breaking the top 10. And you can see that there's a lot of challenges from other platforms that are out there. I mean, Facebook is still number one, but you have other global platforms that exist, right? So if you're looking at like WeChat and you're looking at Skype, these are the burgeoning messaging platforms. I mean, Skype has seen a resurgence lately because of its integration with Microsoft Office. So you can see that that's some of the uptake as well. This was going to look very, very different if you look at the numbers a year from now. So those January 2016 numbers that will be coming forward from We Are Social are going to show a huge rise in Snapchat versus where Twitter is right now. But again, we're looking at this globally, right? This is not just a North American experience. So your experience or your kids' experience or your colleagues' experience will not necessarily be reflective of everybody who's using it. With that being said, again, getting that information about what kind of industries are out there and using Twitter, there's two ways to look at this, right? You can see that that the marketing services obviously is predominant on Twitter from an industry perspective. So lots of volume, lots of noise in people who are trying to get eyeballs, who are working in that marketing sphere. But when you look at other ones like healthcare or financial services or manufacturing even, you can see that these are industries that are not necessarily necessarily utilizing Twitter as a platform. It doesn't mean that they can't. The way I would look at it is that there's a ton of opportunity here for organizations that are working in these different industries to actually broadcast and create an opportunity for them to talk with an audience that they may not have been reaching otherwise. And again, when we look at who's using Twitter, you can see that the major brands and the major enterprises and major corporations are the ones who are certainly capitalizing it on it the most. Small businesses are not utilizing it as much as they could be. So again, I look at this kind of statistic and say there's a ton of opportunity here for small businesses to increase their activity and to garner an audience and speak to an audience that they may not be looking at. Canadians love Twitter, and they continue to love Twitter. Over the last couple of years, I've actually watched the Twitter numbers go from about 23% in the last, 1 and 2 years, up to, again, 37%, which is really interesting to see its growth numbers. Because, where we used to take it for granted that everyone was on Twitter, now I actually have to check in and see who is actually utilizing Twitter on a regular basis. But yeah, it's interesting to see that Twitter's numbers continue to stay positive. All right, so when we look at the users globally who are actually partaking in Twitter, Canada is very high on the top 5 countries of users who are utilizing this platform. So our numbers are really quite huge. I think I was telling you guys before when we were looking at the metrics regarding internet penetration in Canada is at 95%, and about 56% of Canadians who are online and using social are also using Twitter. So certainly is a large platform and a potential platform for Canadian market. So nothing to sneeze at there, that's for sure. One other thing I think is really interesting is that actually Twitter has opened up a global office here in Canada. So you can actually work specifically with a Twitter Canadian team, which you can find at Twitter Canada. So if you look at the penetration in Canada and where things sit right now, you can see that that it is growing, of course, every single year. So again, knowing who is using Twitter is one of those important pieces of homework that we need to do as marketers if we plan on utilizing this platform for our marketing purposes. So let's get into some of the basics and really get our hands dirty. What is Twitter all about? Now I'm going to show you guys a little video. It's a bit dated from 2008, but it does tell the essential story of exactly how Twitter works. So settle in and enjoy.
So, what are you doing? It's one of the first questions we often ask friends and family. Even if the answer is just mowing the lawn or cooking dinner, it's interesting to us. It makes us feel connected and a part of each other's lives. Unfortunately, most of our day-to-day lives are hidden from people that care. Of course, we have email and blogs and phones to keep us connected, but you wouldn't send an email to a friend to tell them you're having coffee. Your friend doesn't need to know that. But what about people that want to know about the little things that happen in your life? Real life happens between blog posts and emails, and now there's a way to share. This is Twitter in plain English. Thanks to Twitter, it's possible to share short, bite-sized updates about your life and follow the updates of people that matter to you via the web. Here's how it works. Meet Carla. She's addicted to her mobile phone, reads blogs every day, and has contacts all over the world. She heard about Twitter and was skeptical. After some of her friends couldn't stop talking about it, she gave it a try. She signed up for free and saw that Twitter pages look a little like blogs with very short posts. Each page is personal and has updates from friends. She got started by looking up her friends on Twitter.com. After finding a few, she clicked follow to start seeing their updates on her Twitter page. Within hours, she began to see a different side of people she chose to follow. She didn't know that Steven in Seattle was a baseball fan, or that Julia in London was reading a new investment book. The little messages from Twitter painted a picture of her friends, family, and coworkers that she'd never seen before. It was the real world. Soon, she became a fan of Twitter and posted updates every day. Her friends followed her updates and learned that she recently discovered a passion for Van Halen. They could see Carla's life between blog posts and emails. For Carla, Twitter worked because it was simple. The updates were always short, under 140 characters. Plus, she could post updates and follow her friends using the Twitter website, software on her browser, a mobile phone, or instant messages. By asking members to answer the question, "What are you doing?" Carla found that Twitter brought her closer to people that matter to her, 140 characters at a time. Find out what your friends are doing at
That's
twitter.com.
a cute short video that gives you an idea of how people are using Twitter independently, and it's you can see that it was. I mean, this is an early video that was done a few years ago, actually, and so I think that the audience on Twitter has actually become a lot more sophisticated than it ever used to be. But let me tell you, let me take a tangent and tell you a quick story about one of the ways that Twitter on a personal level started to work for me. So 14 years ago, my family and I moved from Toronto to Stratford, and Stratford is a fairly close community. It's a small city of 34,000 people, and there's a lot of families that have been around for generations, and it's the kind of city where, if you haven't been around and you didn't come to school here, then it's kind of a hard nut to crack. And so, there's a lot of people here in Stratford who would actually agree with that, and people who have come from away and have moved here. So, as a very social person myself, it was really difficult for me to actually come into the city and not know anybody. So I, of course, tried the very typical ways to do some outreach to a community and find, a group of people that I would relate to. So one of the first things I did was, I went to our local gallery and I took some courses, and I got involved with a book club, and I got involved with some political groups. And although I met some really, really lovely people, I just was not finding my tribe, and I was just not finding the people who I really connected with and that I was resonating with. So, I plodded along, incrementally meeting, people who I became closer with and whatnot. And then Twitter came along. And so, I joined Twitter, and like many people, I started first and then I didn't really do anything with it for the first little while. I just signed up and then I didn't do anything. And then I just started tweeting about things that were happening in and around the city of Stratford. So I'm sure, of course, most of you won't know this, but Stratford actually has this really engaged digital community. And there's a lot to do here in Stratford that is more than just the Stratford Festival, although it is a beautiful, world-renowned festival. There's a whole creative community that exists here that really has nothing to do with the festival directly. So I just started tweeting about things that were actually happening in the community. I was tweeting about food festivals, and there was a new agreement to build a University of Waterloo Stratford campus that was going to be focusing in on digital entrepreneurship and innovation. And there was this whole movement away from being a traditional manufacturing community towards building a knowledge economy. And so this was a really great story. And I started tweeting about all these different conversations and all these different events that were happening in and around Stratford, as well as in my local catchment area, which I was calling, the Kitchener-Waterloo, Guelph, and London area as well. And then I started to actually meet people who were of Stratford, but that I actually hadn't met before. And these were different creatives and professionals and people who I just naturally had a lot in common with. And so, I realized that's where I was, I had an opportunity to actually meet people who were business owners and who owned, arts centers and foodies, lots of foodies in Stratford as well. So it became a natural way for me to connect with people. And then one day I actually received a Follow Friday. And so a Follow Friday we'll talk about a little bit when we look at hashtags. But a Follow Friday is a convention where you either type number sign and then an FF or number sign and the words Follow Friday. And the first one that I had ever received was somebody had written, "If you want to know anything that's going on in Stratford ON, then you follow Karen SD." And it was pretty amazing to me because that's when I realized when I clicked on that user's name that, hey, this was somebody in London who was paying attention to my tweets and hearing what was going on. And that was the beginning of a friendship that turned into a business relationship with a digital agency that I work with currently, and a group of people that I call very close friends of mine, and close intimates. So, through Twitter, you can actually meet that community of people, and I promise you that there is a community of people for everybody on Twitter. If you're into knitting, you can find a knitting community. If you're into UFC and MMA, you can find a community that does that as well. If you're into comedy or vintage, you can find those communities as well. It really doesn't matter what you're into. You can literally find someone talking about what you're interested in. Now, the interesting thing about this book, The Tweet Stock Guide to Twitter, is that this was actually crowdsourced on Twitter. So this was written by a friend of mine named Kevin A. McGee, and he actually found a printer and a publisher and editors and graphics people by seeking them out on Twitter in his local community in Brantford. So it's just one of those great crowdsourcing stories that just shows you the impact of Twitter and really what can happen when you actually reach out to a community of people and who you can actually find online. So this book itself is a few years old now, so it's a little dated. It doesn't cover all of the new content on Twitter, but it certainly is a really, really good, easy, fun read, and it will give you the real basics of Twitter. So after tonight's lecture, I will have this posted and you guys will have access to this. And I do encourage you to actually take a read through it. It only takes you like an hour and a half, 2 hours to read the entire book. And I think it's really well worth your time. So let's look at what is a tweet. So a tweet is depicted here, of course. The whole thing is what we would call a tweet. So I'm going to point to a couple of different segments and we'll go through them one by one. So if you want to reply to somebody, you of course are clicking reply, and you're replying to the name, or what we call the mention, or somebody's handle, their name, on Twitter. And you can see that somebody's full name does not necessarily match their Twitter name. So they're sometimes different. They're often not exactly the same. So a retweet is really when somebody wants to send on the tweet that they've seen. They want to send it on, and they want to send it on to their audience. So if any of you have ever sat on a board of a community group, or an arts group, or not-for-profit, or charity, then you know that when you're in a board meeting, if you want to discuss anything, then somebody has to make a motion. And then if that motion is going to be discussed, then somebody has to second that motion. So they say, I second that motion. That's kind of the same idea behind a retweet. Just because somebody retweets something, it doesn't implicitly mean that they agree with it. It means that they think it's important enough to share with their audience. So you'll often see in people's Twitter profiles, they'll say, tweets are my own, or retweets do not infer endorsement. And for the most part, I think most people understand that now. Sometimes you have to be very explicit, though, about what you are agreeing to or what you're agreeing with and what you're not agreeing with. So I have previously at different times have said, just be, the next tweet that's coming, I completely disagree with. And then I retweet something and then I'll post right after that, I did not agree with that tweet. This is why. Sometimes when you're sending out a retweet, you don't want to play with the content. You want it to sit in the original format. And so when you don't modify a tweet, you'll want to be able to be explicit if you're actually calling out something that's really contentious, or something that can raise a light of ire in an audience. So just be mindful when you're retweeting something. People will sometimes think that you mean that you support something in that regard. So really, you got to be careful about framing that or modifying your tweet so that people understand that if you disagree with something. Okay, we're going to take a quick moment to talk about the most retweeted tweet. Now, in spring of 2017, a young man by the name of Carter Wilkerson had tweeted out to Wendy's and asked, how many retweets for chicken nuggets for free for a year? And Wendy's, with good sass and great, voice on behalf of their community, says 18 million. Well, he put it out there and the world kind of responded for him. So, he hasn't reached that 18 million mark, but what has happened is he has surpassed the Ellen DeGeneres selfie retweet from the 2014 Oscars. And now with his his 3.6 million retweeted tweet, he is now actually holding that honor. So the great thing that comes from this, of course, is not just, when a young man gets his due and he gets his free chicken nuggets for a year, but the fact that that Wendy's is also providing a donation to a not-for-profit that is close to their corporate mission. And so, when people come together in a sense of, a good fun and having some tongue-in-cheek, entertainment with one another, they can also actually impact a lot of good at the same time. A favorite is basically your way to bookmark on Twitter, and it's really interesting actually. So if anybody remembers the story of an American politician called Anthony Weiner, who was caught sending pictures of his private parts that were supposed to be privately sent by direct message on Twitter, and he actually ended up broadcasting those around to a greater audience on Twitter, which he wasn't intending to do. So, since that big, huge monster faux pas, which devastated his political career and probably his marriage at this point as well, since he's been caught doing it since, some of the media actually take a bit of glee in checking out what Anthony Weiner favorites. So, even though that this becomes, it can be used as a bookmarking tool for people. So sometimes they see it and they want to come back to an article and they want to read it. What can happen is it can also be seen by everybody else who's actually following you, as long as your tweets are not private. So just be mindful that if you have a more salacious appetite for content online, and you favorite content, that if anybody actually wanted to pay attention to what your content is that you're favoriting, they can see that. So be mindful of that. So not too long ago, Twitter actually changed the favorite to a like or a heart or an LOL or a say strong. But they changed that favorite symbol into one that is more universally accepted. And really, I would look at that influence probably from Facebook and other social platforms, that instead of having a favorite function, they actually have this reaction function. And I think that's part of Twitter's opportunity and what they're trying to do to actually ensure that the platform is more about engagement rather than process. So a hashtag, hashtags can be a complicated beast. We're gonna look at them specifically in another slide. So I'm gonna hold off on what that means. All right, some notable hashtags that we do want to mention up front, or some notable kind of language in and around Twitter that we want to talk about. The first is a follow Friday, and I mentioned that to you earlier. So here's a piece of advice for you guys. When you want to highlight people in your community or people who have been influential to you or people that you just want to send a little thanks to, then the Follow Friday is a great way to do that. The worst mistake that people get, though, is that is they send out a Follow Friday and then they list a whole bunch of people's Twitter handles and they send it out and they tweet it out to their audience. Well, that is absolutely the worst way to do a Follow Friday. So imagine it this way. Have you ever met two people that you wanted to introduce and you thought, wow, these two people really should know each other? Have you ever walked up to them at a party and said, hey, you two should know each other, and then walked away without giving any context? Well, it's the same sort of thing with a Follow Friday. You want to make sure that you're actually giving people context. Why should your audience bother following somebody that you follow that they may not know about? So what I did at the end of the year, the end of 2014, is I spent a couple of days sending out a Follow Friday of sorts, but I called it a Follow into 2015. And the way I framed it was I wanted my audience to understand the people who I learn a lot from or I'm really compelled by online. So one of them was on marketing, Scott Stratton, who is a really talented marketer who I constantly learn from every time I read his content. Another is a friend of mine who's an author called Marina Adshade, and she's an author who wrote a book called Dollars and Sex. And she is an incredibly smart woman who I love reading her content because it's compelling and it's insightful, and she really makes economics very tantalizing and titillating, which is a lot of fun. So, following her into 2015, my piece was because she's super smart and you'll learn a lot. So, there's other people that I did that with, but I hope you understand that the purpose of the Follow Friday is to give people context. So you want to tell them, follow this person because they're smart or they're talented or they're creative or their work is compelling or they make me laugh. Whatever your reason or your rationale may be, make sure you share that with your audience if you're going to bother doing a Follow Friday. A hat tip is when you give actually credit to the person who actually you're sourcing your material from. So sometimes you read it, you get a tweet and there's an article and it's linked to that tweet, and you read the content and you've either lost the original tweet or the way somebody framed their tweet isn't the same way that you would like to share the information, but you would like to share the information as well. It's good manners, it's good etiquette, and good karma that if you're going to be sending on an article in content with content that you've received because you saw somebody else's tweet, that you give a hat tip to that person. So you can do that on Facebook, you can do that on Twitter, and it really is. This is all around the idea of accreditation and accountability and attribution, and I think it's really important. So it's really important that you do that. So modify tweet, and I mentioned it a little earlier, and that's when you've changed some form of a tweet in its original form. So I had somebody in the early kind of days of Twitter who retweeted something I wrote, but then they decided to add in, a 4-letter word, that not one that begins with an F because I'm okay with those ones, but it was another 4-letter word that I was not okay with because it entirely changed the context of what my original tweet was. So I, wrote right back to them and said, don't ever do that to my content again, and blocked them because it's okay if they want to make a pun out of my content, but then they have to actually notify that with an MT, so a modified tweet. And this person was certainly not doing that, and ensuring that the integrity of my content was actually parlayed onto their next audience. So let's talk about hashtags. So hashtags started off back in like 2007 at an event in Austin, Texas called South by Southwest. So I'm sure some of you have maybe heard of it. It's this huge music, culture, technology conference that happens down in Austin. And this guy wanted to organize people. He wanted to help people find out what room they were going to be in for this specific part of the event. So he said, why don't we just use a hashtag, and then this way everybody can kind of find out where we're going. And that was the beginning of what we call hashtags, of course. Now, originally the symbol, actually, the number symbol is called an octothorpe. So for those of you who actually like podcasting, there's a great design podcast called 99% Invisible by the host on that show, the narrator on that show, is Roman Mars. And there's actually an episode not too long ago, maybe about 6 weeks ago, that talked about the octothorpe. So if you're interested actually in the origin of the octothorpe, it's actually a pretty interesting link. And I'll throw that up really actually in the podcast section of the Google Plus community. So again, a hashtag can actually mean a number of things. So it's not a really easy thing to actually articulate. So it can denote an event. So if you're talking about South by Southwest, it will be SXSW 2015, which would be for 2015, or SXSW15. So it can relate to a conference or, a political event like the Arab Spring that happened a number of years ago. It can be it can refer to an idea or what we call metadata. So if you're talking about something, so if we actually go back to the example here, you can see that summer is given a hashtag here. So if you actually click on summer, then you would actually get a whole bunch of tweets that are related to the phrase of summer. So that would be what we call a metadata hashtag. Hashtags can also be what I call kind of like your inside voice or the parentheses voice, when you're making a joke about something. So like when somebody tweets something and they say, oh, that's, you shouldn't be wearing white after Labor Day, for whatever, one of those silly kind of fashion statements. And then the hashtag would be just saying. Or when somebody posts a picture of their food and their dinner or their desserts and they write nom, nom, nom. So these are all hashtags that are, sometimes they're created on the spot and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're actually they're an agreed upon way of moving forward for a group of people to actually have a conversation. So nobody actually owns a hashtag. Nobody has the authority to create a hashtag. Hashtags are what we call, they become a de facto standard of a conversation. So de jure is an old kind of Latin phrase. It means it's the rule of law. And de facto means it's just the way things are. So I want to take a look at some hashtags actually online. And let's just get a snapshot of what some of those would look like. So let's see if we can find a really quick example of a hashtag. So I'm going to look at the Canadian POLI hashtag. And Canadian POLI is Canadian politics. So when you do a hashtag search for Canadian politics, you're going to find all of these different writers who are specifically talking about Canadian politics. So you'll see that you've got media, you've got MPs, you've got activists, more media, so that that people who are actually using the CDN POLI hashtag are actually, everybody's having that conversation around Canadian politics. So, can you find this in another way? Sure, you can. So if you actually did a search on Canadian politics, you can do a Canadian politics search. And then when you're going through a bunch of tweets, when you get that kind of response, you're going to find the hashtags that the community uses. So you don't have to know a hashtag to get an idea about it. But what you can do is you can search for an idea and then those hashtags will emerge that way. So we can also look at, remember I mentioned that there was a knitting community out there for sure. So you can see that there is a whole community of people who are talking about knitting. So whether they are creators or bloggers or people who sell content on Etsy. So there's a whole community of people who are talking about knitting and sharing their projects, obviously, online. Let's look at some kind of a fun hashtag. Let's say nom nom nom. So you can see here, I hope everybody's eating dinner. Whenever you see a nom nom nom, you're going to get tons of pictures of food and lots of conversation about food, right? You can see here, oh, Pancake Tuesday. So let's click on Pancake Tuesday and see what's coming up on the conversation about Pancake Tuesday. Obviously pancakes, right? So you can actually, you can investigate and find a lot of things that are going on Twitter just by following a different hashtag and seeing where it goes. So you can discover a lot of people that way. Okay. So I think this is a really beautiful website. So let's take a look at TweetPing. So this actually gives you a picture, real time, about the conversations that are happening on Twitter right around the world. So take a look at it for a second. We tend to be very ethnocentric in our view of the social media world, right? We seem to think that North America is kind of like the focal point of all technology, and you can see even here that it's truly not, right? You can see how prolific we've got different parts of the world, right? Europe, Japan, of course, the East Coast and the West Coast. And you can see South America here as well. So, the conversations that are happening around the world are incredibly varied. And if you look down here, you can actually see the hashtags that are actually being, that are the main conversations that are actually happening right now. So in Europe, we saw Team Dornan, so that would be about 50 Shades of Grey. Something going on about the sunshine. Let's see. Trying to catch up on some of these. It would be hard to watch. Team Amber, we're not quite sure what's going on with Team Amber. Why don't we go try and find out what's happening about Team Amber? Let's see what's happening in Team Amber. What's the conversation? Let's hope it's nothing untoward. Team Amber or Team Chloe? Oh, seems to be a Kardashian thing. Oh no. Amber Rose, look at that. And some Kardashian thing. I'm really sorry to have to actually put you all through that and waste your eyeballs on a Twitter fight. But isn't that interesting that in Africa, the main conversation that we were able to capture was a fight between Amber Rose, whoever she is, and one of the Kardashians. It seems like it was Khloe Kardashian. So interesting. Anyway, there's far more interesting things happening on Twitter than what I just clicked on, that's for sure. I think it's really interesting actually to take a look and see what is happening around the world and how different the conversation actually is. So trending you can find on Trends Map. Everybody wants to trend. You know, when you actually launch an event or a product or a call to action, trending means that your content is actually being picked up and is being shown across a region more regularly than other people's content. So when I was part of the 25% documentary, we actually trended across Canada the day that we actually launched the documentary, which was huge for, you know, really a community event that was happening in London, Ontario. And then we were able to trend across the different cities that we were actually premiering the film in. So we premiered in Calgary and London and Fredericton, and we were able to trend across both Calgary and London. So not across Fredericton, which told us that, you know, of course, that the social community there was not as actively engaged as it was in the other two communities. So, you know, when you're looking at things like that from a marketing perspective, what it's really telling you is where your work is cut out for you, right? Like where you have a very active online engaged community and where you need to do some grassroots building if you want to get some eyeballs on your content. So you can always check out trendsmap.com. And, you know, if you're managing a social stream for either a company or an organization, or you're pushing out hashtag activity, then you will definitely get notifications if your hashtag actually starts to trend pretty readily.
Of course, just like all things in any social platform, trends has changed itself. So it used to be about a number of evolving conversations regarding a subject matter. But now, as you can see, you know, Twitter has actually determined that trends should also be very relative from a geographic perspective. So, you know, what could be trending in your neck of the woods may not necessarily be trending in somebody else's neck of the woods. And I think that's one of the things that actually makes Twitter so relevant to us from a localized perspective, right? That it really matters to us when we find that things are happening in our backyards, like, you know, if there's an event in a major city around the corner from us, because we know what's happening globally, we still turn to Twitter for our immediate news and for those kinds of updates. And really quite often we find out what's happening on Twitter before we find out any details on any news channels or anything of the sort. So, but I think it's really interesting that now you can also, you know, you can set your location information so that you're actually getting a very specific trending update from Twitter as well. So, you know, recognizing that it's not just a number of evolving conversations, but it is very much localization that actually is impacting the kind of content that you're seeing from a trends perspective.
All right, so let's look at lists. So I'm going to go live to Twitter again. And we're going to look at lists from my point of view. All right. So you can see here that I have about 48 lists. So in the early days of making lists in Twitter, you were limited to 10, and you could only have 500 people on each one of your lists. And so you had to be very choosy about which content you were going to add to a list. But now, of course, you don't have any limitations on lists. Now you can actually have unlimited lists and unlimited number of people on your lists. But you can see that lists is how I keep track of things. So one of the first things that I was able to do, of course, is ask you guys for your Twitter handles, right? So everybody who has given their Twitter handle to the class has been added here. So Jody, I can see that you really enjoyed the Saturday Night Live content. I did as well. I thought it was a really great show. And if you actually just paying attention here, right, we can see Murray. I can see that you're talking about what's happening in Halifax and how icy things got in Halifax, right? So when I've got you guys all here in a list, I can actually come to the list and actually get a feel for what's going on in a very specific community, right? So how do I use lists? I want to show you TweetDeck because this is actually how I use lists. So you can see from the listings up here that this is how my lists get captured and how I actually view my content using this app. And we're going to come back to this app when we talk about the third-party apps. But this is TweetDeck. So TweetDeck, what used to be a standalone product that actually Twitter bought a couple of years ago, and they've taken it over. And so you can either use TweetDeck as a standalone app, as you can see here, or you can use it in your web browser as well. And what you can do with TweetDeck is you can certainly tweet and you can send out content from multiple different accounts. But you can also actually create this list view so that you can actually see your content coming in depending on how you actually categorize people. So if I go back to Twitter and I'm looking at people to follow. So, not every single person I have is in a list. And you guys may be wondering why I'm not following you directly. One of the reasons is because I actually follow more people than I have who are following me. So I fall under an algorithm limitation that's put in place by Twitter so that it proves that I'm not a robot. So there has to be a certain balance in your numbers. Obviously, it doesn't have to be 1 for 1. But if I try to follow too many people all at once, then it puts a restriction on me on who I can follow. So one of the ways I get around that is by adding people to lists. So even though I may not be able to follow people directly, by actually, following their account, excuse me, what I can do is I can actually add somebody to a list and follow them in a list so that this way I can still get access to the content if it's important enough to me without actually having to follow them. Right? So you can see that this is actually a promoted account. So you can see that I'm not following this account, and I don't necessarily want to waste my follow on that. But if I am looking for something that would fall under ICT, Google, the Google Cloud Platform account would probably be one that would be very relevant, right? The Ontario Budsman don't. I'm quite politically involved, so I would actually go in and I would add this person to my politics list, right? So that's one of the ways that I can actually manage my follower count versus actually making sure that I'm still following people that I'm really that I'm interested in. Okay, so back to lists for a second in the TweetDeck view, right, in the columns view. So you can see here on this side how I'm just going to go to the top, and you can see how actually quickly this content actually starts to update because it does it in real time, and then you can see how the other sections here update a lot slower. So you can see I have different lists based on activism, arts and culture, celebrities, foodies, health and wellness. But I can also in this view as well. So in the app itself, I can also actually create lists rather, or not lists, but I can actually create columns to follow a specific conversation based on hashtags. So we're going to look at that in a second as well. But right for now, back to this the list view. You guys can see how these lists actually update a lot slower and a lot less frequently than my overall following list. So my home feed, that is. So this is the way I actually get to curate my conversation. So, I know everybody in here, then you know that that's everybody here has something to do rather with celebrities, whether it's Aisha Tyler or Bill Maher or Russell Brand or People Magazine. This is what I call my brain fart list, and everybody's allowed to have a brain fart list. But I also, of course, have more serious lists. So I have lists that are based on activism. So you'll see a lot of political, global, social issues that are discussed in the activism space. You'll find, of course, all my foodies and my foodies list, and everything to do with ICT and my ICT space and innovation and entrepreneurs and people who I just find really inspiring and content that I find really inspiring. So you can see that this changes, and this is my opportunity to actually curate. And from a service perspective, you can actually do this on behalf of people. So what you can see here is that, from a marketing perspective, you guys can actually create lists on behalf of your company or behalf of your project, and then people can actually subscribe to these lists. Okay, so let me take a look here. So this was my class list from the last time I did this course, and you can see here that this was these are all the people that I actually had in my class, and then I also had most of the people who were in that class were also subscribers to this list. So what that means is I was curating who everybody was on this list, and the team, everybody who was part of the members on this list, they didn't have to go in and actually follow everybody independently. What they could do is they could actually just subscribe to my list. And then this way, anytime I make changes to that list, they would actually be able to follow that. So what does that mean? That means that they could go into my list and they can actually follow that list without having to subscribe to any one of those people independently. Okay, so let's go back to lists for a second. There we go. Okay, so different lists, of course, will serve different purposes, right? I have I have lists like Toronto, and then I'll have subscribers to that list because everything that goes on here actually has a reference to Toronto, right? My media lists. So the bigger lists tend to have, a handful of subscribers because there's actually value in them. So this way they don't have to actually go through and curate that content. So you can do this on behalf of your clients and on behalf of your own projects and your own businesses as well. So something I want you to keep in mind as well, when it comes to creating a list, you can actually create lists in two ways. You can create lists to be either public or private. So I want you to know that if you actually create a private list, if you add people to a private list, they will not get notification that they've been added to a private list. So this is a great way for you to actually create a list of your competition if you're in a kind of a competitive space. So you can keep track of people who you consider competition without actually having to tip your hat to them and letting them know that you're actually following them. Okay. But just know that if you create a public list and you add somebody to that public list, then they actually do get notification that you've been added to that list or that you've added them to that list. So you can see here that the top part of this screen, of course, is all the lists that I've created. And then you can actually see, the list that I've subscribed to this list. I actually curated this list when I was part of Mars. But then you can also see people who have added me to other lists, right? So they've put it me. So, this political candidate has actually added me to a political list here, right? This is a project that I was involved with a little while ago. So, it's really interesting when you get a look at how people think of you. I always get a hoot, actually, when I go to lists once in a while, and I get an idea of how people view my content, right? So you can see certainly events that I've been supporters of and been a part of. This was a conference that I went to in New York. Again, another conference that I went to a long time ago. And there's a whole bunch of other ones actually. Where are we? Oh, member of. Let's see. Member of. Okay. Sorry, it was a different room. So you can see here, this is how people reference me when they add me to a list. And you'll see this view on your own Twitter list as well, right? So you can see that this is how I'm considered, which I think is really, really flattering in many, many ways. So art influencers, they're fairly new. They've added me to a few lists right now. So you can see I've been added as from a marketing and professional speakers, influencers, interviewees, so who's spoken, who's been a part of a profile as part of this project. I would like to know what that means from a translation perspective. I should use my Google Translate app to figure that out really quickly. arts armed and active. So I love that. Folks who tweet and retweet actively in the visual arts space. Right? So it's always really interesting to see cool people to follow, right? Canadian businesses. So, there's a lot of different ways that people reference you. So you learn a lot about how your audience actually thinks about you when you look at those lists. All right. So keep in mind what I talked about, the difference between a public and a private list, and how you can subscribe to lists, and how other people can subscribe to your lists, and what kind of a service that can be from a marketing perspective as well. So apps. So I don't know if I mentioned this before. If I have, you're allowed to quietly hold up your hand and go 5 times, Karen, 5 times, which is bound to happen at least a few times in this class over the 14 weeks. But one thing, when it comes down to apps, really, I can't tell you which app to use. You really need to go in and you actually need to check it out yourself. So, of course, there's always the native app, and that means that's the app, like you can see here, Twitter. That is the app that the platform actually puts out itself, and that's always referred to as the native app. There's also other apps that you can use. Of course, it depends on the phone you're using, and it also depends on what you're most comfortable with, right? What's going to work best for you. So I've been a longtime user of Tweetbot because I use multiple accounts and I manage multiple accounts. Tweetbot is one of those. It has some great functionality that really allows me to float in between different profiles very easily. So I love Tweetbot. But really, it's just the same thing when I used to work in telecommunications and people say, well, what phone do I need to get? I say, I don't know. Go to the store and try it. And that's what you really have to do. You really have to try these things out, and you have to see how they feel, because each person's usage and why they're going to be more comfortable in an app is going to be really entirely up to you. So one of the things that I did want to cover for you, of course, though, is Hootsuite, and of course TweetDeck, as we already just looked at. So Hootsuite is a Canadian company, as I've mentioned to you before. And it's very similar in the way that you just saw my TweetDeck layout, right? So it's very similar, besides a different color scheme, but I can change the color scheme here as well. But the difference with Hootsuite is a couple of things. So first of all, it doesn't automatically update. What happens is you actually have to go in and you have to actually refresh your stream so that you can see it, okay? But you can keep up to, you can have all these different tabs up here in Hootsuite, which is really interesting. So it's not just, the interesting thing, of course, about Hootsuite, it's not just Twitter, of course. It can also be Instagram. It can also be Facebook. Okay, so you're not just looking at, which of course I don't really have listed here. I don't use it for Facebook much here. But so you don't have to limit your Hootsuite usage to just being about Twitter, although of course it works exceptionally well. So you get to have all of these different elements that you can view on your dashboard, right? So sent messages, direct messages, tweets that have been retweeted. You can also look at, hashtags. So if you're specifically wanting to follow some specific hashtags, you can do that here as well. And those are there's, I think, a limitation to 10 per tab. So you have access to do that. So really, it all depends on what you're most comfortable with, right? So I actually, from a flow perspective, I actually really appreciate the frequency and the speed that happens in TweetDeck. So I'm a big fan of it. But if you need to slow things down a little bit and not have content constantly running through your screen, then I would suggest using Hootsuite, right? So again, because TweetDeck actually, because the content is always updating, sometimes I'll turn around and it'll just be something I catch out of the corner of my eye. And that's great for me. And sometimes I really do need to slow down the conversation, so I'll use Hootsuite that way. And it really just depends on what you're most comfortable with. Okay. I think we've talked about TweetDeck. We've shown you TweetDeck in real time, what that looks like. So now let's talk about how you can utilize Twitter to actually go after a new audience. So you saw that when I was on the Twitter space, you saw that promoted tweet. So promoted tweets don't happen all the time, although it's something that's fairly recent that has started on Twitter. So what that means is that it's like advertising, and it means that you're going to start seeing content that you did not necessarily sign up for, but that Twitter thinks you might find relevant. So this is a promoted tweet. You can see it here. It's highlighted in yellow, and you can see you can either see if you want to be a part of that or not. So let's just see. Is AMCP going to be interesting to me? Yeah, that's kind of actually fairly interesting to me. So you know what? I'm not going to follow them, but I'm going to add them into my marketing stream. So, did that promoted tweet work? Yeah, in the sense that certainly put me it certainly put me in touch with that, person, and I'm just capturing this person because this person is really great person on community, and I do have him in my list, so I just want to make sure. So, in this case, actually, this promoted tweet would work in that sense. Depends on what AMCP is actually asking for. What are they trying to achieve with this tweet? So obviously they're doing a call to action, right? They have an Hermes Awards. We're not sure what the Hermes Awards. Let's click on it and see what that means. So this is a creative awards call to action. So this is a competition that people can actually participate in. So is this relevant for me? Sure, absolutely, actually. And the work I'm doing with a digital agency, for sure it is. So, am I their target audience? Absolutely, I am their target audience. Does it mean that I'll pay attention to this and, maybe submit work? Probably not. But to know that we have an opportunity to actually submit work to this kind of a platform, that's always a consideration for a digital agency as well. So in that sense, it sure does make sense for me to see that content in my stream. Not everything is going to be relevant to you. So you can always turn around and actually, dismiss those kinds of promoted tweets so that you're not getting content that you think is not relevant to you. So much like Facebook, Twitter has gone ahead and created a ton of resources available to its user base so that they can better utilize the platform as a marketing avenue, marketing medium. So whether it's about building the audience or driving sales and activity towards a website, promoting an app, or building brand awareness, very similar to the way that Facebook is approaching that marketing opportunities for businesses, Twitter is doing the same thing. And instead of the Facebook blueprint, Twitter, of course, has Flight School, which I think is really smart branding. And so this is a fairly new offering. I think it's only been out for the last year or so. Nonetheless, it is a great way for them to provide the user base, again, with the content that they need to become more comfortable speaking to not only clients and people that they're working with, but also to executives so that you can actually help parlay the value of utilizing Twitter as an advertising platform. So they provided research and case studies and tools. So those tools can be downloadable templates and PowerPoint presentations and the like. Again, a ton of content here, which is great to see. Twitter really upping their game when it comes to enabling their platform for greater marketing opportunities. Okay. So now let's take a look at measurement, right? And what does that mean on Twitter? So you've heard me say this before, and I'm going to say it again, that it's not about the numbers, right? Having an engaged audience, having a group of people who actually care about your content and care about your business story and care about what you're trying to achieve is far more compelling than tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who actually like your content and don't care about the success of your business or don't really care about receiving your content or the success of your goal, objective, or event or business, right? So I want to take a look here. So, we look at these are vanity metrics, right? So the follower growth, your reach, those are what we would call vanity metrics, right? Your follower growth is literally how many people like your page or are following you on Twitter. Your reach is how many potential eyeballs, remember that, potential eyeballs are on your content. Doesn't mean guaranteed at all. A much more telling metric about your success or failure in your content is this idea of engagement, okay? So engagement tells you, so the impressions here will tell you how many potential people saw your content, okay? So, look at these numbers, right? So I have 5,300 followers. And at any given moment, my content can be on a regular day, either followed by, as low as 100 people or up to a few hundred people. And depending on how popular the content can be, sometimes it can be a few thousand people. It really just depends on how compelling the content is. Now, keep in mind, this is my personal account. I'm not I'm not actively seeking thousands of views or potential that kind of I'm not seeking that kind of attention for my content. I'm really just having a conversation with my community for the most part. But but if you're actually a marketing brand, then the reach and the impressions, of course, is going to be somewhat important. But what's really important here is this idea of engagement. Okay, so let's come up to the top here. And we're going to look at engagement. What does engagement mean? So engagement is, and I can't remember actually how they define engagement, but engagement is here it is. That's it. Total number of times a user has interacted with a tweet. So that includes the clicks and the shares and the hashtags and the content itself, right? So engagements is one indicator of success of your content, but the engagement rate is also is important as well, of course, right? So the number of engagements, of course, or the higher rather, excuse me, the engagement rate, it means the higher an audience is engaging with your content. I know it sounds, it's really awful English to actually use a word to define another word. But this is where we get into kind of that funny gray space. Right. So you can see that I can have actually fairly low eyeballs on something, but I can actually have a decent engagement rate. Right. So, you can see that this one obviously was a more compelling piece of content that I'd shared. This was last night watching the Saturday Night Live 40th anniversary. And I did a quick Siri search, or did a quick Google search rather, and said, how old is Eddie Murphy? And actually the content that came up, I found, was really rather racist. Because, of course, who else came up in that search but was like Chris Rock and Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. Now, there's a whole bunch of different contexts that Google could have used, right? They could have actually chosen to show, comedians from part of Saturday Night Live, or they could have shown, cast members of Shrek, but instead they actually chose Black actors. I thought it was a fairly racist kind of response anyway. So you can see that I got a lot of impressions and kind of engagement right in the very get-go. And, it's still going on today. There's like, one or two people who are still seeing that tweet right now. So it just kind of goes to show you it's a low-hanging fruit kind of tweet, but it actually has some legs on it, right? That it goes on and it doesn't ever stop right at right when it happens. Okay. All right. So let's close that out for a second. So let's continue to look at kind of some of these engagement numbers. You can see there's other stuff that's, really low, and it doesn't mean very much, in the sense of if you're a brand and you're trying to do something with it, right? Funny, right? You can see here that of course, my dinner pictures, which I know some people love to hate, but my dinner pictures from one of my favorite restaurants here in Stratford, that's going to be losing their head chef and losing their front of staff soon. We had a spectacular night of amazing food. And, you can see that there was a lot of people who were looking at that content as well, right? So really, again, from a brand perspective, you really want to see these numbers, the engagement numbers and the engagement rate. Those are the ones that you're going to be paying more attention to. Certainly your impressions and the reach actually matter in the sense of what's the potential eyeballs, but really, again, it's these numbers, your engagement numbers, that are going to be the most compelling about actually really what matters in the sense of your content. Okay. Sorry, and again, conversion is going to be one of those really important metrics as well, because conversion is actually how many people you get to either get to that, fulfilling that call to action, right? So whether it's download a white paper, sign up for a newsletter, or buy my product, that's for when you're talking about, marketing from a brand perspective, that's really, that's it. That's your sweet spot right there, is how much can you convert your audience to actual business goals. So we just looked a little bit at those analytics. You can get a lot of information from your analytics, actually, which I think is, and this never used to exist. You used to have to pay third-party companies to actually get these kinds of insights into your content. So I think it's really important, actually, that you take some time to actually play around in this space and look at these metrics. So we'll bring this up, pardon me, you'll bring this up and you can actually look at the very specific activity around your content. So this is how you actually do it from from a branding perspective. This is actually how you look at your content and you see what are people doing with it, right? So retweets or replies, or what are they looking at? Or are they looking at your content? So you can see here that, I had a high number of impressions. So how many times people saw the tweet on Twitter, but it was the content that they were actually clicking on, right? So they're actually clicking on the picture as well. So it tells you what was most compelling to them, right? My content, ask Google how old is Eddie Murphy? And it gave me back the most racist response. Yes, Eddie Murphy equals all black actors. So that's one thing. It puts it into context, but it's really the response that they wanted to actually see, right? So knowing your content is and doing that kind of good deep dive on it is really what's going to make you successful on Twitter as a marketer. Okay. Of course, this gives you kind of your snapshots. You can change your dates here, right? This is last 28 days, but you can change your dates here. So you can choose a greater range of content, and you can see what your impressions are over a certain period of time, right? What your averages are. You can see your peaks. So let's go see what this one is. What was October 30th? Can we go in and see it? I wonder if we can't. No, we can't from here. Interesting. Apparently I did some pretty awesome stuff on Halloween. So let's see. I don't think it actually gives us our tweets from this date. We'd actually have to go back and look at it. We can export our data. So if we actually do export our data, we can do that. Take a quick look at that. Do wish that you could just click on it and actually see your tweets from that date. But then you can actually open up this content, and it'll just take a second while my program opens. And I'm just going to switch the screen over for you. So this was a podcast that I was listening to, and you can see that it got a lot of impressions, and that would be because Baratunde, who is a kind of a comedian and online critic, actually retweeted my tweet. So you can see that his retweet carried my content a lot farther than it would have gone all on its own. That was a response to a big online magazine called Hello Giggles, and that, of course, they retweeted it, so it got a lot more traction than it would have otherwise. And this is some of that kind of investigative work you can do. I mean, really, you can get lost in the weeds here. That is for sure. You can spend a whole lot of time, trying to look at your content. But if you're a brand, this is the important work that you should be doing, actually. You really should be coming through and looking at your content and seeing, what resonated most with people and what didn't. So this was around the time I was young Ameshi. So yes, a few of my tweets actually got some traction around that conversation. So yes, I certainly remember that day, and there was a lot of activity for me actually on Twitter over a couple of days there. So I'm not actually surprised to see a peak in my my content and my engagement numbers during that time. Anyway, okay, all right, informative always. Okay, so that's analytics. So, do take the time and, go a little further and see what content is actually resonating with your audience. Also in your analytics, of course, you can see your followers. So let's go look at our followers live just to get an idea. So when I said to you, know who your audience is, you really should know who your audience is. So this has been my community growth. And you can see it's a fairly steady growth, right? So I don't have these massive spikes of anything. And, but it's always really interesting when you look at actually who follows you. So the people who follow me are predominantly male, which is interesting. I wouldn't have thought that, actually. But what are they interested in? So this is when you actually create your own profile on Twitter. So I have, not a surprise that I have a lot of people who actually follow me from kind of my local areas, which is really interesting, of course. But also around entrepreneurship and marketing and startups and leadership and advertising. So again, not very surprising to me that is kind of who is, that's the audience actually that I'm resonating with, because this is the conversation that I'm having online all the time. So, if you know your audience or your content well, none of this should be a surprise. But of course, if you're coming in and as either a community manager or a social media manager, this will be really informative for you so that you actually understand who your community is as well. So I wanted to take a couple of moments and just talk about some of the new features that are coming out as part of Twitter. So you may or may not have seen polls that have started, and they are now an integrated part of the Twitter experience. And what happens is somebody does a poll, and then you answer the poll, and then you can actually watch what happens in that conversation. And then you'll get a notification tweet later on that says, hey, you participated in a poll by so-and-so, and here are the results, so that you can follow up and follow through and see what the results were of that poll. So that's an interesting way to engage with an audience. You can be really funny about it, and you can be really kind of flip and just straight from the hip. Or you can do a very purposeful, very integrated approach from a strategy perspective as a brand or as a business, and have a conversation with an audience that actually drives very specific answers and very specific conversations around content that you're trying to get responses for. Then there was the launch of Twitter Moments, and Twitter Moments was one of those really kind of weird launches. I had and then lost Twitter Moments no less than 4 or 5 times on my app and on my desktop. So I don't think it's been released incredibly well by Twitter. And Twitter Moments are basically that trending that we talked about earlier that other apps give you notifications for. It's a way to gather like very like huge volumes conversations that are happening at any time on Twitter, and they put some relevant content. So they're curating that content in and around that conversation. They put them together as Twitter Moments so that you can run through them. So whether you're talking about a sports final, or you're talking about a political campaign or an election, or some global event like a catastrophe, then Twitter Moments is a way to capture all of those conversations in one place. There's also been conversation recently about Twitter considering changing the length of a tweet. So the 140 characters was actually built off of an old technology that Twitter was originally developed on, and that is SMS. So an SMS message can only be 140 characters. And that's why Twitter started with that limit. Then there was talk about recently Twitter just changing entirely the platform and giving like a 10,000 character limit to tweets, which I have to say, I was definitely in the camp where I was up in arms about that. Absolutely 100%. I personally do not want to see a 10,000 character count in my Twitter feed. I would stop using the platform probably because there's something to be said. There's a certain je ne sais quoi, there's a certain talent to be able to actually articulate something in that 140 characters. And, I appreciate the conversation on Twitter for that. I appreciate the brevity, and I appreciate the creativity, and I appreciate the constraint of that and how people communicate using Twitter in that framework. With that being said, I mean, you've also seen the evolution of tweet storms where people will tweet out, 20 or 40 different tweets in a row, and they'll number them so that you can actually follow their line of thinking. And I love tweet storms, and there's a great dialogue that happens in that way as well. And there's other people who will take a large piece of text and then they'll make it an image, and then they'll import the image into their Twitter feed, so that becomes kind of their long form conversation, which is also, I think, very effective because it's actually at least visually engaging. So I think that there's ways around it. I've been happy to hear that Twitter is not necessarily going ahead with the 10,000 character limit, that instead what it's doing is actually taking out web links or images from that 140 character limit, which I think actually would be a wonderful improvement for the service without messing around with that integrity of the original service as it was delivered to the public as well. And of course, there's been a whole ton of conversation about the death of Twitter and how it's dying. And while I certainly think that Twitter has its challenges, and it's not necessarily growing as fast as other social platforms are, I think having a monthly average or active user base of 310 million people is in no way any kind of failure. So when you hear that kind of language, that Twitter is dying and whatnot, I want you to consider very much who the source is, right? So in this conversation, that source can often be related back to venture capitalists and people from Silicon Valley who, are looking for specific rates of return on their investment and those kinds of conversations, which is totally legitimate. But to say that a platform is dying because they're not seeing the kind of growth that they would like to see as venture capitalists, I think is irresponsible and also pretty myopic. Twitter has an harassment problem, and it's not going away. Whether it's women who are being specifically targeted online, and all you have to do is do a quick search on Gamergate to have an example of the kind of vicious, ferocious, violent, offensive, repugnant behavior that women face online. So I didn't capture any of that content because, quite honestly, I don't think it would pass the acceptable use policy that we have at George Brown for having content contained within a course. And I caution you seriously when you go in and you start looking at that content because it is incredibly offensive. So I don't want to go into a tangent about Gamergate. You can do a Wikipedia search and certainly get some information on what it's all about. But I do want you to pay attention to the fact that when people say things like it's all about ethics and journalism, you can look and see how much they're not talking about journalism, but attacking women who are part of this conversation. Anita Sarkeesian, the woman on the right, she was a woman who does, academic thesis work on looking at the female trope in video games and has been attacked both personally, professionally. She's had her site attacked and shut down. Her life has been actively threatened at speaking engagements that she has been engaged to speak at. So this isn't fun and games. This is people's lives. And these are just small examples of the kind of harassment that women face online, especially notably on Twitter. And now there's this new special thing that's happening amongst the haters out there. And what they're doing is they're identifying people who are of Jewish descent, mostly, by identifying them by using their names within these three occurrences of parentheses. And what that's done to other, usually white supremacists out there, is it identifies somebody and then they become the subject of just ferocious hatred and bigotry and violence directed at them. So these are some of the problems that actually exist in this realm, right? And it's not to say, though, that Twitter isn't responding. I don't think that they know exactly what they're doing all the time. But they are engaging in a conversation. They are looking to experts. They are admitting that there is a problem. And that is actually a lot more than a lot of other platforms are doing. So I give full props to Twitter for making the effort and working on fixing this platform so that it becomes less of a haven for violent misogynists and racists and more of that uplifting communal space that it was always intended to be. Not to say that also Twitter doesn't have its own challenges within the company. Silicon Valley is not known for being diverse at all. So the fact that women are not being reflected or people of color are not being reflected on their board is no surprise, but they're getting there and they're making those changes. I still think that they have issues, right? They kind of trying to be all things to everybody. But when they do, things go awry, like their music strategy. And talent comes and goes from any kind of organization. But I think this is an opportunity for Twitter to really pay attention to what it wants to do and what it wants to be in the future and stop responding to a whole slew of ideas, but focus in on what the company does best, what the platform does best, which is enable community and enable true engagement and conversation. So last thing I wanted to mention about kind of the challenges for Twitter is competition is certainly heating up. You have the onset of Snapchat and other messaging apps that are really kind of blowing the numbers out of the water in this last year about the rise of messaging apps. We'll talk about that later on in the course as well. But when you have Snapchat, that they have their daily active users is sitting at 150 million, and Twitter's daily active users are sitting at 134 million. That shows that the company is losing traction with some audience members, so it needs to find a way to make sure that it's relevant ongoing. All right, so Twitter chats. So, as I said to you, there is a community online for everybody in Twitter. So, what I want you guys to do is I want you to participate in a Twitter chat. And what you can do is you can find a chat that is interesting to you. And I want you guys to actually get involved with the chat. So either I want you to participate in it or I want you to listen to it. And then I want you to share that chat with us in the Google Plus community under week 5, under Twitter, and put a link to the Twitter chat or the hashtag at least so that we can actually get an idea what the chat's all about. And give us a quick, 1 or 2 line synopsis of what the chat was and whether you found it valuable or not.
So there are a number of ways for you to find a Twitter chat. And so I've listed here on a couple of pages some listing websites that give you access to those Twitter chats. And you can find their schedule and who's hosting them at any given time. This is a particularly good one, Tweet Chat. So if you actually go to tweetchat.com as well, you will find a listing of Twitter chats that are happening at any given time. But I need to clarify something because without fail, every time I do this course, I get somebody who actually, either watches the American Music Awards or the Oscars, and they listen in to the social chat going on around that hashtag, and then they tell me that they participated in a Twitter chat. So I need to clarify that a Twitter chat is not a hashtag. A Twitter chat is something that is scheduled, it is something that is hosted, and it is something that has questions and answers. And so following a hashtag is not the same thing as participating in a Twitter chat. So check out one of these 3 resources as a starting point, find something to participate in, and let us know how it goes. All right, so you don't have a ton of homework this week, but this is what you are responsible for doing. So you are going to do that Twitter chat and share that with us in the G Plus community. And then I want to make sure that you go in and you're going to secure your own Twitter profile. So if you don't have a Twitter profile, you're going to start one. And if you do have one, then you're going to make sure that all of these different parts are actually a part of your profile. So you're going to make sure that you have your handle. You're going to have a complete profile, including a photo and a line of your bio and a cover photo. So not just your profile photo, but a cover photo as well, right? You can choose a theme if you like. That's going a little above and beyond. Then I want you to start creating at least one public list. So what you're going to do is you're going to create a list, and then you have to add at least 3 different people to that list. Okay, so here's the thing, here's a reminder. If you have your Twitter account private, I will not be able to see your lists or any of your content. So you need to either keep your account private, take screenshots, and put them into a Google Doc and share those with me, or make your account public so that I can see them. If you fail to do these 2 things, I will not be following up with you to say I can't see your account. You will just get 0 marks for this week, okay? Because I cannot babysit everybody to make sure that you've done these things. So make sure you make your account public or you do the screenshots and you put them in a Google Doc for me to see, okay?
All right, guys, that's it. Long lecture this week, but I hope it was worthwhile for you. Of course, we always have our resources. There's tons of content here that you guys can access at any time. Remember, these are resources for you, right? This isn't required reading, but you always get more out of anything the more you know. All right, you guys have a great week and enjoy the weather, and we'll see you on Twitter.